So our three panelists, as I indicated, are incredibly esteemed. Their resumes are quite long. And so if I actually just went by their resumes, it would take the full hour. So I'm going to give an abridged version, but recognize they're incredibly accomplished. Kent Roach is Professor of Law and Pritchard Wilson Chair of Law and Public Policy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto and of Yale and a former law clerk to Justice Bertha Wilson at the Supreme Court of Canada. Professor Roach has been editor-in-chief of the Criminal Law Quarterly since 1998. In 2002, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In 2013, he was one of 4 academics awarded a Trudeau Fellowship in recognition of his research and social contributions. In 2015, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. He is a prolific author and civil rights advocate. Welcome, Professor Roach. Evan Bray is Chief of the Regina Police Service. Chief Bray is a 27-year veteran of policing with 6 years in the Chief's chair. Chief Bray has held various positions with the Regina Police Association, was formerly president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Police Officers, as well as director of the Canadian Police Association. Chief Bray is a strong, compassionate, and community-focused leader who is deeply committed to serving his city and making it a safer place for all. Welcome, Chief Bray. Michael Kempa is a social scientist with a PhD in law, working as an associate professor within the Department of Criminology, University of Ottawa. His program of research draws upon political science, international relations, and sociological theory to address the ways in which states and non-state organizations conceive of and attempt to institutionalize police power in such domains as the economy, new forms of urban communal space, and international security. Trained in media through the Monk Fellowship in Global Journalism, Dr. Kemper tries to take the results of his research to the broadest possible audience. So thank you. Welcome, Dr. Kemper. And so we'll get started. And we'll start with Mr. Michael Kempa.
Okay, I'm going to open up a slide deck, which I'm going to go through a little bit quickly because we don't need all of the detail. I'm just looking for my little share button here. There it is. There we go. Really what I wanted to focus on today is just talking about another layer of challenges that have come upon policing in the context of an increasingly ideologically charged and politicized country. Okay, so as complicated as policing is, we now have an additional set of challenges in the form of political polarization in our country. We all know that polarization is gathering steam in Canada. There's an era of dark politics around us, very topical at the moment, obviously, with the Rouleau Commission kicking off its work tomorrow. Look at least the public dimension of taking evidence into what led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act around the Freedom Convoy and related series of protests and occupations across Canada. We can't forget that there's ideologically motivated violent extremists on both the far right and the left of the political spectrum, although smaller on the left. Generally, though, where we have groups of people that are not supportive of modern, capitalist, democratic nation states, this will make trouble for the police in that the police are meant to be the bulwark and the embodiment of that democratic state system. Practically speaking, protest is taking up an increasing amount of policing resources and time and puts the police in a very structurally difficult position. So where we have a society that is divided on many aspects of policy, at the moment, a great deal of division over public health policy. If the police are put in the position of enforcing laws which are unpopular, this, of course, makes it more difficult for the police to promote much in the way of community support, at least across the entirety of the population, or even more difficult to do so, such as it is. The famous quote coming from former Chief Peter Slowly in Ottawa, of course, was that there may not have been a policing solution to the problem of protest and occupation in Ottawa and division around vaccine issues, political divisions, and so forth. And I give you that quote here to underline the idea that the solution to the question of how the police must adapt to dealing with a politically polarized society is not likely to be a technical one. It's not a scientific problem. It's not a simple problem. It's very much what a popular term from the 1970s would be termed a wicked problem, in the sense that it is something that is bound up with many other social, political, economic issues that cannot be solved by the police themselves, although the police can be a significant part of improving the situation. There's much that the police can do and police governance bodies can do to improve their position in that structural context, if not completely revise it. So the point that I'm going to build to today is that navigating this polarized society requires community-centric forms of police training and practice, which is essentially the opposite of professional isolation. The next thing I have for you here, this is just a quick set coming from the literature, the definition of wicked problems. We don't have to dwell on them here. Suffice it to say that wicked problems are those issues that are bound up in many structural forces in one moment in time. So they're political, social, economic problems in which your institutions find themselves embedded. It adds up to the idea that there's no formulaic or single legislative or single training or single police initiative response that could possibly change the outcome all by themselves. The other thing about wicked problems is they occur in the real world. So where you modify your institutions or training to deal with that problem, if you make a mistake, it compounds the problem. So everything you do has an action and reaction in the sphere of the problem. In a sense, every time you try, you may find yourself having to redefine your approach to dealing with a problem that is already moved along on the ground. So just a quick set of comments about polarization in our society. This idea of the left-right or backwards left-right political spectrum is breaking down a little bit in the sense that there's a bit of a convergence on the extreme right and the extreme left of people who are deeply suspicious of state institutions, deeply suspicious of scientific authority, and deeply suspicious generally of global institutions that have a role to play in setting global standards or circulating global ideas, sort of like a horseshoe appearance to that left-right political spectrum. And the police find themselves in the middle of it. So something to point out here is that as we're moving further into the extremes from, say, far-right activism into far-right, right-wing extremism, these numbers have been growing. And the Freedom Convoy, Frank Graves has done a very nice job of highlighting the way in which the most radical elements were very effective at pulling people further in that direction through using the hook issue of COVID-19 vaccine mandates to introduce people to certain aspects of more radical right-wing ideologies. This tail end, if you were again picturing that horseshoe, is smaller, but it is also growing. Left-wing activists and left-wing extremists, the distinction being you get into the extreme category when you start talking about using violence or advocating for violence. And this group has been mobilizing the specter and the fear of the far right to help pull ordinary left-wing activists further into their domain. This has consequences for you all in policing. So a bit more familiar for us at the moment in terms of the Freedom Convoy discussion. The far right has an ambivalent relationship with policing. On the one hand, they highly value infiltrating police and, for that matter, military and electoral institutions. They love to have access to state institutions for informational purposes, for training purposes, and as a recruitment ground. On their surface, far-right groups typically present themselves as being extraordinarily pro-law and order and pro-freedom and pro-the charter in that sense. And they expect the police to support their aims. So very often if they have an ethno-nationalist or a definition for Canada that they'd like to advance that's based on ideas of ethnic identity, they expect the police to uphold those values or to uphold their interpretation of charter rights and freedoms. And they get very angry when the police let them down in that respect. If the police their violations of laws to do with legal assembly and protest, hate speech, and so forth, they can get very angry and direct violence towards police organizations, such as we saw in Coutts, Alberta, with the allegations of planned police killings as retribution for the RCMP's involvement in breaking up the blockade of the border. The far left, the extreme far left, regards the police as a key pillar in systems of structured oppression. And then we're moving into odd ideological times on the extremes of the poles of ideology, in that groups are no longer pure in their ideological expression. They're tending to pick and choose elements of extreme ideology and put them together into their own sort of little bespoke groupings of radical ideology. So the term that's been in some of the media has been salad bar extremism, where they take a little bit of, say, anarchism and combine it with anti-science, sometimes white supremacy or not, and sort of tailor it to their particular leanings. So depending on who you're talking about on the far left, they either focalize mainly on class or race, racialization, gender oppression, capitalism itself. But by and large, they regard the police as being a key pillar in this system. They point to what they see as failures of decades of community policing as evidence against gradual approaches to police reform. And therefore, they tend to be advocates, if not violence against the police, of, at minimum, abolitionism, a radical interpretation of defunding the police as a cog in the capitalist machine, or white supremacy, or whatever category they tend to emphasize. And the consequence of that has been the removal, at least in the United States, of an entire generation of some of the most progressive police leadership. Many in this group have a policy of no academic engagement, either with police and often the entire criminal justice system. So, for example, a challenge that I would face from even some of my own colleagues would be that I am a part of the capitalist system of neoliberal or race repression, on the basis that I would even be willing to work with a police organization on, say, a community safety and well-being program with them. Now, there are inconsistencies in these arguments. Sometimes these groups tend to be in favor of hate speech legislation. They're very preoccupied with the hate speech they see as coming from the far right, which would actually require, of course, state enforcement and prosecution, which would have police involvement. So that hasn't been quite properly resolved. But all of that is to say is these are the increasing pressures in which the police currently find themselves. So just some ways forward. The theory behind this would be you're not likely to find a formulaic answer to what you should be doing to overcome the opposition coming from the far right and the far left. So there's not an ideal approach, say, to recruitment or training, or how exactly you should organize police engagement in community safety and well-being. There's only working on these problems and attempting to solve and resolve them as they evolve on the ground. One thing that's clear is that retreating to formulaic professionalism, saying, well, then we'll take the politics out of policing and have them be the neutral enforcers of the law, accountable to the courts, and perhaps some form of apolitical governance body. It's unlikely to be the answer. We know that from around the experience around the world, where the police have been highly politicized, attempting to professionalize them has not solved the problem. You can look to Northern Ireland or other places where the state has been contested. So as I say, there's no final solution. There's only resolving and resolving them, which is to say, keep working on them. And it's less about scientifically analyzing the system as it is about opening spaces in your organizations through training, through community fora, through your governance bodies that permits for argument between participants such that there's negotiated outcomes in your approaches to engaging community safety and well-being and advanced community policing. So, I mean, in a sense, obviously, for example, the current inquiry into the Emergencies Act is, in a sense, a forum for deliberation and argument where the competing viewpoints on what the Freedom Convoy even was will be presented. and ultimately negotiated in some fashion in a public capacity. So a little bit of what that means for practice. There's really no way to get around it. On the one sense, we do need to quantify and study the extent of ties between policing and mainstream political movements. We do have concerns in society, such as we saw around the Freedom Convoy, that there may have been some level of sympathy in police organizations for certain aspects of the Freedom Convoy. However true or not that may be, it is a serious public perception and something that we need to research, to actually quantify, just as we did with the military and have been doing with the military. If we don't know the nature of the problem, we are not in a good position to address it. The other is to start integrating policing to a greater degree with community safety and well-being plans. We've got a problem, and my colleague Kent Roach has pointed this out so well in his new book, where our police governance bodies are typically separate from our municipal bodies that are putting together community safety and well-being plans. It is troublesome if they're not rowing in the same direction for achieving much in that domain. One simple solution or step towards a solution has been at least to encourage mayors to take their positions on governance oversight bodies so they can at least coordinate between what's happening with police planning and CSWB planning on council. Training for police officers really has got to include some sort of social justice component that familiarizes recruits with the major shifts in national political and culture landscape that's ongoing, along with emphasizing mediation skills. And it's pretty clear that a police college, perhaps one that has nodes across the country, would be helpful on those dimensions, just in the sense of exposing police recruits to a variety of the types of pressures on the far left and the far right. There's so many things overlapping, as I said, in terms of salad bar extremism, where there's an influence in some cases of Western separatism and alienation, and in others not. Others to do with more anarchist streams of right-wing radical politics, anti-capitalism, race-based politics on the far left. It's so complicated and different in different parts of the country that having some training in different nodes across the country would be extremely valuable in that respect. So I think the point to take from it being a wicked problem is, it sounds negative, but actually it's a little bit liberating in the sense that there isn't a final scientific solution to it. There's only experimentation, forging forward, and solving and resolving as we go, which I think might give us a little bit of courage to try things and keep track of our successes and failures. So I can leave that there for now, and of course take questions when the time comes a little bit later on.
Thank you, Dr. Kempa, for getting us started so well. In my opening comments, I talked about the fact that civil informed dialogue predicated on building understanding is critical. And I hear a lot of that in what you're saying in terms of these wicked problems, not just a simple fix, but getting away from the polarization and coming back to where we can have these civil dialogues. So thank you so much for getting us started so well. Next, we'll turn them over to Chief Bray. Your turn, sir.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon. I mentioned to some of you early on the call, I'm coming to you from sunny Weyburn, Saskatchewan. We're here for Saskatchewan Association of Chiefs of Police meetings, and so I just broke away from the meeting to have this interesting discussion here today. So, you know, I'll keep my comments short. I actually want to engage in some good conversation, but there are a couple of things that I want to talk about, and I thank all of the organizers for the Coalition for Canadian Police Reform for inviting me here. And my opening comment is, if you're a contemporary police chief or police leader in Canada today, you should be pro police reform. Police reform is something that we absolutely have to embrace and have to work towards. Devon, you used the word evolution earlier. I think that's a brilliant word. Ultimately, that's what we're talking about. As a chief of police in Regina, my job is to constantly look for ways that we can improve, reform, evolve, a whole bunch of things that speak to policing, and do so in a way that it meets our community's needs, it meets the challenges that we face every day, and really speaks to some of the, I think, the conversations that we have with society. And over the last well, I'll say decade, but predominantly in the last 2-3 years, I think there's been a lot of conversations with our communities and with society in general around policing and what they would like to see in policing. So, I'll touch on just a couple of points with regard to police reform. First of all, service delivery. I think we have to think about how we deliver service to the community. And so during the last couple of years, there's been a lot of conversation around, why do police go to the calls that they go to? Why is it that police are going to calls where it's an assist citizen call, or it's a welfare check on someone who maybe has some mental health needs? And so, that's one of those conversations that we as police are very interested in having, because it's been said many times before, 60 to 75% of the calls that police go on in Canada are not criminal in nature. They're steeped in social issues and social challenges that police are not well equipped to solve. In fact, when police get there, it's because it has evolved to a place where crisis has broken out. It's become a risky situation, and police are asked to step in and deal with a situation that probably has been occurring or building up for quite some time. And so recently in Regina, we signed a call transfer protocol with a community organization called Mobile Crisis Services. They really provide crisis services to people that are dealing with social challenges that may not be police issues. And so we may still get the call, because when people see someone who's lying on a street corner, asleep in a bus vestibule, doing something that seems not right with the societal norms, they call police, especially at 2 a.m. That's who they're going to call. And so signing this call transfer protocol is just one small example of what I would call police reform in service delivery, where we can send an agency that isn't the police, and if they need us, of course, they will call us. And so I won't go too much deeper into that. I think oversight is an area that is constantly in a state of reform, and something that we have to embrace in policing. There are lots of agencies, and at Regina, we are one of them, that have signed on to a violence against women advocate case review, which essentially brings in people that work with survivors of sexual violence. They do casework with them and have for years. They come into our police service and they review our sexual assault investigations. And by doing that, what we're seeing is not necessarily fault in investigation, but challenges with procedures that our police officers will undertake. So, for example, if someone calls in to report that they've been the victim of a sexual assault, and they're someone who have had encounters with the police in the past, if we ask them if we could take them to the hospital because we would like them to be examined by a medical person, and we transport them to the hospital in the back of a police car, that is very much victimizing someone who is a victim. It's re-victimizing them. And so, those procedural steps that we can take are often caught by experts in the field who work with survivors of sexual violence. So in Regina, we willingly bring in a group of non-police workers who work with the Regina Sexual Assault Center, and they review all of our sexual assaults 4 times a year. And every time they come out with recommendations for change. We've been doing this for 3 years. They just did a review not that long ago, and they said, to be honest, there wasn't a lot. We were quite impressed with what we saw. You've made changes to policy. My friends, that is reform, and that is police oversight. That's a form of police oversight that I think is outside of the box, and it's not unique to Regina. It happens in other centers as well. Human resources is another area where we need to embrace reform. We can't train the way we've always trained. A trauma-informed approach, we know, is the right approach on many calls and forms of policing that we go on. Recruiting, we have to find ways to reduce barriers and understand that there may be some barriers that some of us can't see, but some of us in the community are impacted by, just by virtue of the fact that it's been set up in a system that is not geared towards newcomers in our community or our indigenous population. I know my friend Dan Belgard is on this call. Dan is a leader in Saskatchewan when it comes to police boards and police governance, and so I'm telling you right now, Indigenous recruiting and policing is extremely challenging to do. And part of it is we've got to look at the system and the barriers and what can we do to make our organizations not only diverse, but inclusive. And so EDI work within police organizations is something that is woefully needed. Funding, finding alternate sources of funding. We're constantly looking for ways. Municipalities are challenged with budgets all the time, and there's lots of criticism around how much of a police budget will take in an overall municipal budget. And so are there other ways to fund, and that's a form of police reform. And finally, just the philosophy in policing in general is changing. It has changed. There's lots of room for continued change. But if you just look at drugs, if you think about the war on drugs and the work that we used to do as police officers on that versus where we are today, I'm writing letters of recommendations in Regina for harm reduction. I am constantly being a champion for changes that bring about more opportunities for harm reduction in our community, because in Regina, Saskatchewan, people are dying every day from overdoses. Last year, we had well over 2,000 reported overdoses in our city reported to emergency services. That's, we're going to 4 or 5 overdoses a day, and that's ridiculous. And so until we can get some long-term change, then we need harm reduction. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police are advocating for the decriminalization of the simple possession of many drugs. 10 years ago, if you asked me if I thought we would see that, I would say absolutely not. And I'm leading the charge on that work, because understanding that charging someone who has a substance use disorder is putting them in this cyclical, systemic system that is likely doing very little, if not nothing, to solve what is a health problem. So how can we find ways to help them? And the last thing that I'll say before I turn it over to Kent, I believe, who's talking next, is I very much believe in a philosophy of customer service. And so to the point that we've worked customer service into our strategic plan at the Regina Police Service, and that includes offenders. Offenders are customers of ours. We're involved with Holly Campo, some may know, from the University of Alberta, doing some work with us now. We're actually going down into our detention facility and interviewing people that are in detention. And she's talking to them about their interaction with our officers, what that was like. But she's also talking to them about what in your life might have been different, that if different, would have changed you sitting in this cell and talking to me tonight. And I'll tell you, participation rates are almost 100%, because no one ever talks to that group of people about their concerns and their points of view and what they would like to see different. And so we're weaving that level of customer service into the work that we're doing at the Regina Police Service. I love policing. I believe wholeheartedly in policing, but I also believe in the need for police reform. And that's why I'm very proud and honored to be here today. Thank you.
Chief Bray, 27 years, 6 years in the Chief's chair. Please don't leave anytime soon. You're no fossil. You're leading the evolution. So thank you so much for being here and being with us. Much appreciate what you had to say, sir. And now finally, Professor Roach, please bring us home.
Well, thank you very much, and it's an honor to follow both Michael and Chief Bray, and I'd like to thank the Coalition of Canadian, the Coalition for Canadian Police Reform. I guess I'll just start. I think where Chief Bray has left off, and that is, the sort of police officers that he wants. We really have to change the way we educate and recruit police officers if we're going to have people that are well suited to work with community groups, to recognize the expertise of community groups, and especially Indigenous groups, and also to want to make a lifetime commitment to policing as an honorable profession. So that's why, I'm a fan of the idea of a college of policing. We know that people are, policing is a good job now. It's relatively well paid, and the people that go into it often feel underutilized in what their talents are. And so I think that one of the things we have to think about is, how do we recruit in a more open-minded way? I was fortunate enough to work on two task forces that reports are free from the Canadian Council of Academy. And one of the things that I really enjoyed working on that is that we had both police leaders, not only from Canada but from Britain and the US, and police officers, as well as academics that specialized in it. So the Canadian Council of Academies, it's not like a public inquiry. They don't make recommendations. But if you're not familiar, their report on policing Canada in the 21st century, New Policing for New Challenges, is available free on their website. And then their more recent report, Towards Peace, Harmony, and Well-Being, Policing in Indigenous Communities, is similarly available. And this is what is kind of a first step for an outcome-based, evidence-based, continuous learning process that the police need, but unfortunately do not often have the resources for it. I worked as director of research for Justice Epstein's review of missing persons investigations, and that's giving me an additional perspective on policing. And of course, there is a need for police officers to be aware of the challenges and the diversity in Toronto's LGBTQ2S+ community. But at the same time, there is so little training time, and so much of that time is spent with necessary qualification, requalification on the various arms that policing that the police carry. And so I think we really do need to think about a new way of educating police. And that's why in my new book, and I'll hold this up, Canadian Policing, Why and How It Must Change, which I started writing after George Floyd, and does include some comments on the policing of the Freedom Convoy. I make what I thought was a really out there recommendation, and that is that the RCMP shut down Depot and replace Depot with a multi-jurisdictional college of policing that would allow people not necessarily to have to go to the Regina, but people that are perhaps a little bit older, perhaps have more life experience, perhaps have families, to hopefully stay relatively close to their homes and to be educated. And that ideally these would work in consultation with various post-secondary institutions. And, I think we're going to need federal money to have something like that, and we're going to need federal leadership. And one of my concerns is the debate over RCMP contract policing has become this kind of zero-sum debate. Either you're for it or you're against it, and much of it driven by the federal subsidy. And so that's why I think the federal government should say, look, we're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I agree with Michael Kempa that there is no one scientific answer, that we are in a era of experimentation, but also evaluation. And it's those linkages, as Chief Bray talked about, with people like Holly Campo, that are going to lead to kind of improvements. And so one way to solidify that is actually to move, and perhaps it's not. I mean, it may be that certain weapons training doesn't make sense to do that at a community college or a university. But I think that we need to have more continuing relationships, but also involving continuing education, and allow post-secondary institutions to act as a bit of a mediator and a safe space, because there are some community groups that, rightly or wrongly, don't necessarily feel that the police station is for them a safe space. So we need to kind of work with those community groups. And so, I very much hope, whether it's the emergency inquiry or the mass casualty inquiry, that a message is sent to the federal government that the status quo is not working. I mean, the Harper government recognized that it was economically not sustainable, but we need to recognize that policing as it is not is both economically but I fear socially not sustainable. A few other things that I want to mention. One of the things that I think I bring to writing about this as a lawyer is that I do appreciate what Winnipeg police officer Robert Christmas has called the quadruple jeopardy that is faced with the accountability industry, which is frankly making a lot of lawyers rich. My concern is that we're putting too much emphasis on ex post accountability when we think something has gone wrong, whether it's through criminal investigation, civil litigation, charter litigation, or a police disciplinary regime that is too much this kind of crazy Frankenstein amalgam of a paramilitary discipline procedure and a criminal trial, run often by criminal lawyers who represent the officers and seem to fight a lot of cases like that. And so we need to kind of recognize that while that may be necessary for the rule of law, it's not necessarily improving policing. And so we need to look at more ex ante. So the systemic reviews. I was counsel for Aboriginal Legal Services on Golden, and we won. And, I realize this may not be the most popular case with many people watching, but we won restrictions on strip searches, rightly or wrongly. But we know that some police agencies were extremely slow to implement these admittedly complex changes to the law. So we need to think about more systemic reviews, ex ante guidance, and frankly, as much as when I listen to Chief Bray, I'm very glad that Chief Bray is in the position that he's in. But I worry that given that we don't give enough resources to police governance, that if it were not for enlightened police leaders, and I've met very many, and I would include, frankly, Chief Slowly, who was very helpful when we were working on the Epstein report. Last week, I was talking with the Winnipeg police chief. We do have these progressive police leaders, but we need police governance, and that police governance has to be driven by a sense that we can take democratic ownership over how we educate police and also the policy of operations. And I really worry that we're creating this situation where the governance people don't have the resources that they need. They don't have the evidence-based resources and just the basic knowledge. And, you know, thankfully we have good police leaders for the most part, but we can't assume that that's always going to be the case. So I think we need to emphasize police governance. We need to train the governors of the police and educate them side by side with the police, because it's a complex. I mean, it isn't, I mean, there has to be informed civil conversation between the responsible minister, the police board, the municipal council. The last thing I'll say is, you know, although I welcome the movement towards community safety, and this is, you know, I think an outgrowth of the hub models and an idea that the hub models should be writ large, we still haven't gotten the governance part right. And so my review of the published community and well-being safety plans required under Ontario legislation shows that, you know, we're giving localities unfunded mandates to deal with the social problems that Chief Bray talked about, the problems of addiction, particularly the problem of housing. Over and over again, those community safety and well-being plans talk about how housing, but housing is not even one of the mandated ministries to come to the multi-agency table. So I also think that we need, I think it's a good idea, but we need to have governance ally with multi-agency community safety approaches that also recognize the role and expertise of community groups that should also have access to a community safety fund. Again, subject to evaluation, because we're all going to make mistakes. And as we try to do something different, and, you know, we should try not to play a gotcha game. We should recognize that communities, academics, police are in this together, and to try to experiment but evaluate. So I look very forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. I hear you tying in that wicked problem at the end that Mr. Kempa talked about earlier, and people failing just to recognize the symbiotic nature of what's occurring right now in community and society. I think so critical. So thank you all three for really just excellent commentary on this really important issue. There were a number of really good questions, and I think I'm going to go back and start with yours, Dr. Kempa, because somebody had a good question right at the start, and I'll have you respond to that. And again, it's in relation to the wicked problem that we're talking about. And this question comes from Roger. It says, is homelessness a wicked problem? And if so, what role does the police play in it? And that's a critical one that we're facing right here in our city right now.
Yes, absolutely. And that would be the point, that homelessness, addictions, mental health, economic opportunity, these things are all blended together, and none of them can be tackled in isolation. And certainly none of them could possibly be finally solved by the police organization acting all on its own. I mean, that would be the literal definition of an impossible mandate for a police organization. But all that's to say is that there can be a role for the police in contributing to the betterment of that situation, which will likely be different in many locales across the country, depending on what other programs are being run. I mean, my other concern for that, obviously, is just as Kent Roach was just saying, if the provinces download the governance of these problems to community safety well-being planning at the municipal level, but there's no funding there, you're setting up cities for failure and police organizations that can make no contribution to blending with any kind of program to better the situation. So in that sense, it sounds almost depressingly complicated, but the upshot sort of is your organization can only do the best it can on chipping away at the problem in each locale, and trying to coordinate with your municipality and the other community agencies that are involved in the CSWB components of housing. It does take some pressure off you in the sense that you're no longer seen as the agency responsible for resolving all of these problems. I guess, which is one, it creates more realistic expectations on the part of the public. If that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Chief Bray, for raising your hand, because I was actually going to pose a follow-up question to you on that. I always believe that the chief of police's voice is a very loud one in any city and can be used to address some of these issues. So can you speak a little bit around that same question, Chief Bray, and tell us what you have to say?
I love that question, and I'm happy to talk about this. So here's what I know, and I'll talk about Regina, but it's no different across Canada, is we are called to calls for service where people who are homeless are the subject of the call for service. And so I think in my comments, I referenced in the middle of winter, someone sleeping in a TD Bank vestibule. We had a call last winter. A gentleman walked in fairly intoxicated, put his hand in a plate of fries, grabbed a handful of fries and ate them in a restaurant. We got called there. The owner of the restaurant and the people in the restaurant, they want this fella out. Right? He's intoxicated. He is freezing cold. His hands are blue. It's middle of February. And all they care about is we want him out, because there's an expectation I can go to a restaurant and this isn't going to happen. But the reality is, and going back to customer service, is we have a duty to help this gentleman too. So what can police do? Police can make policy and procedural changes that said, we are not just taking Tom Smith, if that was his name, to jail. What we are going to do is we are going to connect him with the 24-hour mobile crisis unit that is up and available. And we are going to, of course, if he's intoxicated, that adds some complication to it. But we have a Housing First program in Regina. And so we mandated that our officers fill out a Housing First form for members and submit it to Phoenix Residential, who do the Housing First program. We actually have a presentation that we do with Phoenix Residential in Regina using one case subject. This gentleman was arrested 1 year, 238 times by our police service. 238 times in a year, taken to detention, almost every time without criminal charges. After being housed in Housing First, we intersected with him 6 times. 5 of those times we took him home, to his home, and the other time we took him to the hospital because he needed medical attention. So what can police do? We can invest ourselves, change policies, change procedures that align well with community, well-funded, to Michael's point, well-funded community organizations and programs that can truly assist on social programs.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
And I mean, if I can just add, I mean that level of integration in Regina is what I was looking for in many of the Ontario plans. But you look at North Bay or Thunder Bay's plans, where being unhoused is no joke, as it is no joke in Regina, and I don't see that level. I would also add, though, that the other thing that I would do is record the amount of person hours and resources that are spent on these kind of calls, because a lot of social problems are being dumped on the police, and in some ways you are the canary in the coal mine. And let's face it, fiscal winter is coming. It's going to take us forever to get out of the hole left by the COVID, and a recession isn't, going to happen, and so I think it is important both for healthcare and for policing to record these kind of basic statistics, because hopefully then someone, whether it's in the provincial capital or the federal capital, will wake up and say, this is a very expensive way to deal with this social problem. If someone, that person who was arrested 230 some odd times probably also was in the emergency room an awful lot of times. And so I think, one of the things is we know that the budgets are siloed, but I think progressive police leaders can do something to, and I also see with Chief McPhee in Edmonton, who wants to have this conversation, and also about the role of charities and others, is unfortunately you have to be our kind of Statistics Canada on how we're failing on these social problems. And I know that's not what police people signed up for, but right now you're at the cold phase, and by doing that you can then give people in civil society and politicians the ammunition to say, look, we need to do this not only to be more compassionate, but also to be smarter and more cost effective. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Professor Roach, you raised this topic, and I would love to hear all three of you comment on it, because you talked about the training or effective training and education of police governance bodies. In my time, I always thought the relationship was somewhat dysfunctional between civic officials, police boards, the chief, and I said we take really good people, but we put them in really difficult situations. We wonder why we have such a messy outcome. So I'd love to hear a perspective of what you think a healthy type of environment like that would look like, so that we can have proper governance, police relationships with the boards, and then good outcome for communities.
Well, thank you, and it is a very important issue, and it's really one that is a crucial issue that I address in my book. I actually think number one is we need good statutory definition of what is legitimate police independence. And so I think that we've had enough controversies over this in this country, including a current one involving the RCMP and mass casualty, that we need to set out clearly in legislation, so it's understandable to the public, the police, and the governors, that you don't order the police to investigate someone or not to investigate someone. So there needs to be that core. Then I think what there needs to be is a procedure that allows everything else to be negotiated between the police and the governors. And there needs to be, kind of clear signals, so that if the police board or the responsible minister wants to take responsibility, then it can issue a public directive. There may be some things that need to be trimmed out of it because the public should know certain aspects, but basically there should be a presumption, and everything else should really be a kind of back and forward. And I think that what you need to have regular meetings for all of those who are responsible for community safety, and you really need to talk about, much like you do in the hub model. And so I think police governance has to start looking a little bit more like the hub, with more community groups and also elected officials. Because whether we like it or not, in a democracy, there's two types of police states. There's the police state where the politicians tell you who to investigate and who not to investigate. We never want to go there. But we also don't want to rely simply on enlightened police leaders to provide a democratic direction to the police. And again, I worked on the Upper Wash inquiry, which is widely misunderstood, because many people thought that what Justice Linden would say is politicians shouldn't go near the police with a 10-foot pole. But if you read it, and this is consistent with everything from the McDonald Commission back in the early 80s, what Justice Linden said was not that, but rather there should be clear lines, there should be core in police independence, codified, but there should be directives. And only in Ontario now, are with the new legislation, I hesitate to say new, 3 years and not proclaimed, but there's at least directives. But what in my view is missing is police independence defined in a clear, rigorous way, as Justice Hughes recommended way back in 2001, really centered on law enforcement discretion. And this idea of operational independence, I think, is not a good idea. And I'm sorry that it's now taken a life of its own and almost is used by politicians to shirk their responsibilities. Yes, if the police have the best plan and politicians, the elected responsible authority, are okay with that, then that's okay. But this idea that the police are all alone in determining their operations, I think, is fundamentally misguided. We also need, as I say, to have the staff. And, I hesitate to say this because I saw the same thing with Gladue. The Toronto Police Service Board has an executive director. They have a staff. I don't think it's a coincidence that Toronto's response to the Freedom Convoy was much more effective and more transparent than the response that we saw in many other places, and particularly Ottawa. So if we invest in police governance, just like if we invest in police training and evaluation, it's going to pay off in the long run. But it's up to people like me and Michael to try to convince politicians that that is the case with the assistance of police leaders.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, and then I'll come to you, Chief Bray.
Sure. I just added one little wrinkle to that. I think there's also been a little bit of a spiral in police governance bodies, the boards, in that the confusion around operational independence has had boards shy away from their legitimate management role and fall back into almost an exclusively critique or criticism role, which has compounded the problem of making police leadership even more reluctant to involve their boards in any matter of operations. So to make that real, and not to pick on them, but again, in the example of Ottawa, we had a situation where board members were saying that police leadership was refusing to share any operational plans with them around the Freedom Convoy. And, one sort of cynical response can be, well, can you blame the police leadership? There's been leaks on this board of in-camera information to the media and constant critique of every step that the police leadership has made on Twitter and other social media by board members. So it's gone in a cycle and compounded. So that definition that Kent is talking about can help start to break that type of cycle and remind boards, you're not just here as a complaints forum or a post hoc accountability forum. You are fundamentally a management body. You develop and set the budget with your police executive. Part of your responsibility is assisting your police agency in achieving its objectives around its community programs. So part of your role is facilitating communication between the police and communities that they're trying to reach and so forth. But with that poor definition of operational independence and that shutting down, a lot of boards have fallen into the fallback position of being critique bodies.
Absolutely. And obviously, Chief Bray, you're an active police chief working with your board and your council. And some situations are beautiful, some are not. Do you have anything to add? I'll just put it that way. I would never put you in that position.
First of all, I really like listening to these two dudes talk.
Yeah.
I appreciate Kent and Michael. I'm sitting here not as an academic, and so you've got a great take on something that I live every day, and so you bring a lot of good points to it. I think there's a couple of things I would say. Number one, I think our police boards need to be invested in properly to give them the ability to do that. So it's not just about staff, because I think that's a thing. I think they need staff, but I also think they need training and education as well. But along with that, and aligned with that, has to be a culture change in police organizations. So back to reform on what the board's role is, because I took over as chief of police, and I was brought up in this era. Do not let the board try and step into operational decision making. Well, that's true. If we're doing a SWAT call on a drug house, board members aren't going to tell us what to do, nor should they expect that. But when we're talking about how we're going to combat social challenges in the community, they absolutely should. And I think it needs to be a culture shift for policing. It's this whole culture that's built up that we have to protect, kind of that operational work that we do. They don't want to do that operational work. They don't want to get into all of those nitty-gritty things, but they certainly represent our community and have a vested interest in governing our police service to provide the best service possible to our community. So I think it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship that needs to be kind of massaged on both sides of the table. And yeah, I think that the points made today, I really appreciate both Kent and Michael, what you had to say about it.
Fantastic. I'm really enjoying this. Dave and John, I just want to check on the time. We're at 4:39. How much more time before I move on to the next question?
Devon.
Yes.
In my opinion, the conversation is going well. There are good questions. I do believe if people have other appointments, they would feel free to drop off. So my advice is let's continue to go. This is an excellent discussion and it's very worthwhile for all the participants.
I am loving it. I'm going to ask a question. This is a real deep one, and it comes from Daniel. So let me read it out in its entirety. It says, First Nations are trying to find our way out of colonial system of justice, including policing, to a way that balances traditional forms of social control with the contemporary requirements for law enforcement. An example occurs when First Nation protesters in favor of traditional law and governance, traditional land use, BC, face court injunctions on behalf of developers. What does the First Nations self-administered police service do to balance the rights of Indigenous people with the rule of Canadian law? Great question. I'll start with Professor Roach. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, that's kind of a difficult question. Let me just back up though, and self-administered Indigenous police services are, the most underfunded police services. They've declined since 1991. Often their officers are overworked and underpaid and recruited by municipal police services that can pay them a lot more. So, I think we need to have more Indigenous self-administered services. Should they be on the front lines in enforcing injunctions against protest? I'm not aware. I mean, most of the situations that I'm aware of, whether it's Caledonia or the pipelines, are involving the OPP and the RCMP. And I think that, generally here we're seeing that, the police have learned some lessons, but these are also really friction points. And so I've been very critical of judges who have expressed impatience at when an injunction is ordered. I do think that it is legitimate police independence, and most of those injunctions are going to have a clause recognizing it, when and how to enforce it. I do worry, though, that those issues are adding to a level of mistrust. And of course, that level of mistrust then ties into what many people, and certainly I in the book, talk about as the vicious circle of over-policing and under protection. And so, these issues have to be dealt with. But I also think that they can be dealt with by government. I think the way the Ontario government ended Caledonia may not have been everyone's cup of tea, but I think the government does have to take those sorts of hard decisions in the public interest. I don't think judges should be saying, okay, the injunction went out now, why aren't you back in 24 hours? And I worry a little bit about the Ottawa situation because it did create that kind of impatience. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, and this isn't exactly on point, but it's something I've been thinking about since I learned it in July. And maybe most of the people here know, but I had a chance to spend some time with some Anishinaabe elders in July. And one of the things we talked about was what was the meaning of the Bear Clan. And, you're all aware of the Bear Clan, the volunteer group, but the Bear Clan in Anishinaabe teachings are the people that are responsible both for peacekeeping and for the medicines. And I thought, geez, this is just another example where, as a non-Indigenous Canadian, if you're open to learning from Indigenous people, you can learn a hell of a lot, because that's exactly what we're doing with people in crisis. And it took us 400 years to realize that you need to both keep the peace but also respond to the underlying issues that lead to disturbance of the peace. So even in Indigenous protests, I think it's very important to talk to the leaders, to respect the diversity within Indigenous communities, and to be respectful and open as much as is possible, and to give an opportunity for self-policing, and only to, and this is consistent with Robert Peel's principles, which may not be Robert Peel's principles, but are still good principles, only to use coercion and force as the absolute last resort. So it was a difficult question, and I meandered around it, but hopefully I got to it eventually.
No, I think you got to it, and I said, that's a deep question. That's why I went to the academics first. And so I do know that the chief has to leave in 10 minutes. So I'll just say, if you have anything to add to this question, then I'll let you leave, and we'll continue with Dr. Kempa.
Yeah, I don't, and I've still got about 10 minutes. I just wanted you to be aware that I have to step away, but I will give another plug to Dan. Dan is the fact that Dan's on here does not surprise me because of the interest that he plays in policing. He is on the board for one of our only Indigenous police services in the province of Saskatchewan. And I think, Kent hit the nail on the head. We need them to be seen as an essential service and funded accordingly. You can't have a police service run on a 5-year contract with no guarantee of sustainable funding. And so, I think that would go a long way to entrenching a lot of the issues that Dan and other leaders like him are addressing.
Okay. And before I move on to Dr. Kempa, where can we find your book? Is it widely available, sir?
No, no, and don't buy it on Amazon because they're selling it for twice the price. It's highway robbery. If you Google Irwin Law, it's a small Canadian publisher, and it's only $34 there. So I can't get it in Indigo, and I probably should have gone to Michael Kempa to get some lessons about disseminating my research widely. But anyway.
All right, love to read it, so I'll definitely look that up. Okay. Mr. Kempa, you can follow up now on that same answer to that question. Yes, your answer.
Just a couple of very brief points. Just as both have said, the issue of funding is primordial for First Nations policing. It's very difficult to even evaluate successes and failures where funding is so poor that in many cases the programs just aren't functioning as intended. The second, one of the things that I've been wondering about is the under-realized maybe potential of some of the provincial quarterback type oversight agencies. So for example, in Ontario, the Office of the Inspector General, or OCPC, similar bodies in the provinces, to coordinate across the different policing approaches in a province. So, in standard urban, municipal, independent policing governed by police services boards of the conventional variety versus where municipal policing is provided by provincial police services in smaller municipalities or federal RCMP providing contracted policing, and then either independent First Nations policing or where it's provided by either provincial or federal policing. Is there some form of role for the provincial offices in coordinating to some extent, not just resources, but best practices, common practices, highlighting different approaches that have worked in those contexts, and almost, getting involved when invited in an advisory role where problems may be encountered, such that body could then advocate to the province responsible for whatever might be required. So I don't know how more formally to put it other than the underexploited quarterbacking role of those provincial agencies.
So, Dr. Kemper, you'll be so thrilled to know that the way that we set up the inspectorate was that we have an academic advisory council. If you're not there yet, we'd love to have you as part of that. But we also said we need to have within the inspectorate the Center of Excellence that does everything that you just described. So I'm glad to hear that, because it meant that we're set it up right.
Okay,
and
perfect.
So,
Good.
yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it will be. So really thrilled to hear that you're full of that. So thank you so much.
Good.
Fantastic. So here's another question. This question now is from Joel, and it's for all of you. Ask, what is or should be the relationship between police and civil society organizations? I think you've addressed it, but you can't hear a good thing too many times for it to really sit. So I'd love for you to address that question. And first, I'll go to Chief Bray, as you have to leave, if you'd like to touch that question first.
Well, I mean, I think this whole discussion comes to speaking about listening to our communities and listening to our stakeholders. And so, to me, you've got civil society organizations are truly invested in digging into social issues, finding ways to work, with I don't want to say structure, but current structures, but work within the communities that they live in to find solutions to those, and often solutions that are out of the box or maybe innovative in nature. And so, to me, it's an untapped resource, or maybe not often enough tapped resource. And so, if you're an innovative police leader that is looking to find ways to reform, enhance, and evolve policing, to me, those conversations have to happen.
Awesome. Professor Roach, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I would say that they're partners, but I also think, and this borrows something from the academic world. The main federal funding agency in Canada wanted to encourage academics to work with civil society groups. So they created a fund where there is funding to encourage those partnerships. And so I think that provinces need to do that, because goodwill is important, and a lot of good work can be done without funding. But at some level, there should be some envelope that is available that says, look, we have a partnership. This makes sense. We're going to enter into, a 5-year plan. It's going to be evaluated. And then that allows the civil society to have money. Because again, if fiscal winter is coming, and I think unfortunately it is, charitable giving and so on, Canadians are not as generous as some others in charitable, because a lot of us feel that we give at the office in terms of our taxation rates. And I think that, we have to build on these partnerships, but also fund and evaluate these partnerships. Thank you.
Fantastic. I see that Daniel has raised his hand. Daniel, would you like to ask your question or comment now? And then I'll go to Dr. Kempa. Daniel, if you're speaking, you're still muted.
Thank you.
What?
Sorry about that. I want to thank you all for your responses to my question. I also want to say that most of the discussion has been around municipal police services in larger municipalities. And here in Saskatchewan, we have 3 times, or maybe at least, we have the highest rural crime rate in the country. Northern Saskatchewan has 3 times the rural crime rate of southern Saskatchewan. And I guess a rural area would be any town or city under 5,000, plus of course all the reserves and all the farming communities, etc. So I'm wondering, given that there's the type of agencies and the type of resources that are available in rural Canada compared to the resources that are available in the municipal centers, how do we go about really doing the kind of work that's required for reform and for bringing the various agencies together in a community safety planning process? And I think that's the challenge for us right now. And I think, I hate to say it, but the catalyst might be James Smith in Northern Saskatchewan. It's going to have a major impact on how things are being done, I think, First Nations policing and public safety in general.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much for the question, Daniel. And hopefully, if there's an inquiry or an inquest, it will look at that issue, because it was also a factor in the Colton Bushy Gerald Stanley case that I examined. I also think mass casualty should and I predict will be looking at that, and that's an important inquiry because it has both federal and provincial jurisdiction. And as you know, one of the problems with a remote and rural policing is divided jurisdiction. And I just wish that the federal government had seen this, because again, I don't see contract policing as a yes or no proposition. For the most part, is that I think the issue is, how do you combine the limited resources that you have in rural and remote areas that make the most sense? And there's no one answer, and it's going to be different in Nova Scotia and than it is in Northern Saskatchewan. But hopefully these 2 tragedies will draw some attention, and even more importantly, some funding to these issues.
Yeah, and the gangs are becoming very mobile, and they're reaching out to the reserves and to the small towns in this province. So we're going to be in for a little bit of a rough time in the near future, I think.
Yeah.
We have the leadership to help lead us there. So Dr. Kempa, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the last question, though, which was, what is or should be the relationship between police and civil society organizations? You get to wrap that one up.
I would reiterate the point that there should be an envelope of funding to support cooperative, practical-based research in that way. The other wrinkle that comes into this, though, is very often the loudest critics of public policing involvement in community safety and well-being often extend almost a free pass to community organizations to use public money for community safety. And although many community organizations may have good intentions, some of them also have a history of troublesome relationships with different racialized groups and Indigenous communities and so forth. So just to say, you need to have a system of accountability for whoever is getting public money for community safety. So whoever we bring in and involved in the community safety, well-being, or community policing envelope in that way, or family, they do need to be governed in the public interest. And not all organizations are created equal in that way, although they all have progressive-minded sounding names. There would have to be some form of vetting and control.
Thank you. So I see that Franco had to leave, but had a really good question that I'd like to have the 2 of you respond to. Franco asked, In trying to find solutions between the far right and the far left, how do we work in the values of the individual officer on the street? So we can have great policy, but ultimately it's the individual officer who is enacting it. How do we work that in? What would you say to that question?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question, in that obviously police are all humans with their own political orientations and biases, implicit and explicit, like the rest of us. And, you know, that again has to come down to training, in the same way that we make an effort to identify implicit biases with the purposes of training around them. We just have to have our political viewpoint, have consciousness of political viewpoints in, and the impacts of allowing our political impact viewpoints filter into our street level enforcement and order maintenance and that's where I was getting to that small idea just around some form of social movements training for police officers, just so that there is awareness of the inflamed nature of a lot of these positions. I mean, you have to be aware of them to begin to try to manage them.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that, Professor?
No, I mean, you know, I also think that we need public education about, you know, the impartial police role, but we also need to educate the public that, you know, talking to protesters is actually something we want the police to do, and not play a gotcha game with that, which is not to say that we shouldn't criticize divergences from police impartiality. But I do have some sympathy for the fact that, you know, after G20 and after Ipperwash, we were telling police to be careful and overreacting to protests. And I think that that's something that hopefully will be explored in the Rouleau Commission.
So I think I start to see the numbers dwindling, and all of the good questions. I think I've gone through the majority of the questions. So I'd like to close with this one final question. And again, I think it wraps up everything that we started with in terms of arriving at a better destination, in terms of the relationship between police and community. One thing I've come to realize is that the community wants to have a better understanding. They want to know why police do the things they do. They really want to have a good relationship. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do what I've heard many of you talk about, educating the public. And I think a forum like this is a good start. I would like to hear your thoughts and suggestions of how do we continue to advance this, building that relationship through excellent communication to the public about why we do the things that police do. What are some of the good steps that we need to take moving forward in your perspective? I'll start with Dr. Kempa. Go ahead.
It's obviously a big question.
Yes.
Look, for me, it comes back to the question of wicked problems.
Mm-hmm.
And wicked problems doesn't mean that therefore it's a free-for-all. You just run whatever programs and hope for the best. It means that in an absence of certainty, you try innovations that appear on the balance of evidence to look as though they will work well, but critically you keep track of your successes and failures, and then you're honest with the public and your management bodies about the failures, partially as a means of managing expectations, but also to avoid replication of those failures elsewhere, just so that some of our better innovations take hold and spread.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't expect you to solve it. I just want to put it out there, but thank you very much.
I did my best.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also think that we need to include focused discussions with police rank and file, and also maybe talk to police educators. That many of us like the idea of a policing college, but frankly, we need to know more about what the challenges are that people that are now responsible for police education face. And I know that in Toronto, they They do at times try to bring in community groups and others. So I also think that we need those discussions, and I think we also need to have structured face-to-face. One of the things that Michael said that's alarming is that there are people, and there is a polarization of views on policing, and some people just don't even want to have anything to do with the police. And I think we need to try in some way to reach out in a safe way and start having some of those discussions. And one of the things that I found was optimistic after the George Floyd moment in June 2020, which was a very violent month in Canada for police citizen relations, is there was a rethinking community safety report that was done with the Gerstein Society, Canadian Civil Liberties, and Black Lives Matter. And that seemed to me to be a healthy opening for a debate, because it was evidence-based, and it wasn't saying we're going to abolish the police, but it was about what do we know about things that we might do better. And one of the ways that we might do better is by detasking the police, not abolishing the police, but detasking the police and allowing other agencies and community groups to at least provide the lead role with the police there as the 24/7 response. And that Rethinking Community Safety report, it's only about 20 pages, but it's the best, and I think the most educated thing I've seen in Canada on this issue. And so to have a debate with some of those people, and also with more people within policing, I think would be constructive.
Before I turn this over to Chief Castles to wrap us up, I just want to really, on a personal note, thank you both for being engaged this afternoon. I can tell you personally, I've taken a lot away from this because I'm heavily invested in this work, and it's wonderful knowing there's individuals like you out there as well working in this area. So thank you so very much. So Chief Castles, back to you.
Well, thank you, Devon. All I can say is my personal appreciation to all of you for participating. I believe this has been an excellent, a very excellent session, and one that we must build on. I want to just turn it over to my associate, John Lilly, to conclude. I know he's going to talk about funding our coalition. We are a struggling coalition that's accomplished a lot. We have a long way to go. This is, seething creation of national training standards in a college. We know we're in this for the long haul. So funding is important. We are now a registered charity, and we can issue tax receipts. So if I could ask you, please, if you decide you want to give some of your hard-earned money to charity, would you please consider us, because we do need some funding for us to continue, even administratively. And John, I didn't mean to take your thunder, but please go ahead.
Oh, I think you said it all there, Dave, and thank you very much. We are applying for funding to some foundations around and about, but it takes some months before you hear decisions, and the costs continue. This webinar, I can honestly say has been successful because the people who are present here today have either joined the coalition or purchased tickets. So that's great. Thank you for that. In closing, let me thank the speakers, and especially thank Devon as MC, since he's thanked the speakers. But Devon, you have insightful and wonderful a way of drawing the best of people out. And Kent, you're a wise man. And Michael, you're wise. And of course, we've lost the wise Chief Evan Bray. All of this contributes so well to the dialogue. And, I'm pleased that a number of people have been here today that are new to this conversation. If any of you have ideas on how to grow our movement, how to appeal to young police officers, senior police officers, citizens of the nation, members of civil society, let us know. So thank you once again. Really appreciate you giving us your time. Devon, Kent, Michael, and Chief Bray.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for having me.
Be
Thank
well.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.